Hi, I'm Bernie Tershy. We're going to get started. I was told that 8 minutes after is like perfect Telluride time. It's super exciting to be able to talk about my favorite subject, which is biodiversity conservation, preventing extinctions of plants and animals. So, as you guys know, we're really lucky to live on a spectacular planet that's blessed with this huge abundance of plants and animals that have evolved over hundreds of millions of years. And they give us all kinds of good things, like medicines, like food, like recreation, like even spiritual values. And as you also all know, we're losing these plants and animals. We're losing this natural heritage at this kind of unprecedented rate. And when you guys think about the images that you associate with the biodiversity crisis or with extinction, they tend to be images like this. And this is a true image. You know, it's not photoshopped or anything, but I hate images like this, or I don't like them very much, because they focus us on the problem and focus us on loss and sort of inhibit or limit our ability to find solutions to the problem. And there are all kinds of really exciting success stories in the conservation world. And so for me, what I try to do is find those successes and combine them with really good scientific data on what biodiversity we have, what plants and animals we have, what plants and animals we're losing, where we're losing them, and the causes of those losses, or why we're losing them. So that's what Harmony and I are going to try to do today. We're going to kind of walk you through sort of a primer on biodiversity and biodiversity loss, and tell a success story of saving a bunch of species from extinction, and then talk a little bit about a new group that we're starting up here. So, we have about 7.5 million species of plants and animals. Almost all of them are animals. There's about 6% of plants. Despite Dawson's best efforts, we don't really know much about the status of plants, so I'm going to focus on animals. So if we go down and we look at the animals we have, that's 6.8 million or so animals, almost all of them are invertebrates, right? Like bugs and corals and worms and stuff like that that most of us don't even think about. There's only 1% that are vertebrates like us, but that's the 1% we know something about. That's the 1% we have some good data on. So here are the vertebrates. There's about 81,000. About half of them are fish. Then it goes kind of amphibians at 19%, reptiles at 12%, birds at 13%, and then the remaining 7% of mammals like us. So that's what we have, and that's what we know something about. So if we look at those 81,000 or so vertebrates, here's what we've lost in the last 400 years, and here's what's really endangered. The black down here is extinct. So the extinct mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. And you can see that what we've lost is kind of constant across these different classes of mammals. It's like between 0.5 and 1.5% of species. But then if we look at the critically endangered species, these are species that are most likely to go extinct really soon. Elephants aren't critically endangered. Lions, cheetahs aren't critically endangered. Wild dogs aren't critically endangered. These are the really, really endangered stuff. They're really skewed towards fish and amphibians. So now let's talk about why we're losing them, or what's driving these species to extinction. There are only 4, you can take all the threats to plants and animals and divide them into 4 categories. It's invasive species like these carp, habitat destruction like this illegal gold mine in Peru, hunting, overexploitation or take, signified by this pile of bison skulls from the Great Plains, and pollution. So right now, just in your head, kind of rank these. Think about which ones you think are the biggest drivers of extinction, and now I'll show you the data. This is kind of what it looks like. So these are for the percent of extinct species that were driven to extinction in part by invasive species, habitat loss, exploitation, and pollution. Most species have like multiple drivers to extinction, so that's why this equals more than 100%. But you can see that invasives and habitat ones are the important, right? So like all that noise about the plastic pollution in the ocean and all that stuff, it's not a really big driver of extinction. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it's not a really big driver. Yeah, Dawson.
Sorry, just quick
Yeah.
clarification. So is this amphibians, fish, or is this all fours?
That's a super good question. It's a good thing we have a PhD student here. This is everything. This is plants, animals. So now, let's look at where these extinctions are occurring. We can take the entire Earth, we can divide it up into 4 habitat types that are sort of the way I've looked at things. Oceans, 71%, continents, 26%, islands, 2%, and freshwater is less than 1%. So now, I want you guys to guess what percentage of all the extinctions do you think have happened in the oceans? Any guesses?
50?
50% from Art Goodtimes. Very smart man. Anyone else gonna like
15.
15? There's a 15, there's a 50. 90%. There it is.
46.
0%.
Zero.
0%. All that talk about ocean conservation, overfishing,
Really?
all that stuff. The plastic garbage bin in the middle of the ocean. 4 recorded genuine marine extinctions. Okay, so now continents. 26%. That's like all of Colorado, Alaska, the tropical rainforests. Any guesses?
20.
20.
50.
50. 11. Okay? So now, like, it would take me a half an hour to figure this out, but you guys are quantitative, so now all of a sudden you're thinking, dang, 89% of the extinctions must have occurred in that 2.8%. And if you thought that, you're right. It's like this, 61% on islands, 28% in freshwaters. But they only make up this tiny fraction of the Earth's surface. So if you're trying to like prevent extinctions and optimize things, that's where it can make sense to go. That's where I went. So now I'm going to tell you about these 2 organizations I started and a project, helped start, and a project we did that kind of combined that big bar around invasive species and that big chunk of the pie chart around islands. So it's Conservación de Islas, which was like worked in Mexico and neighboring Latin American countries and the Caribbean, and then Island Conservation, kind of the sister organization that worked internationally. All these 2 organizations do is go to islands, eradicate invasive species, and then watch the native species numbers recover. So, this is the project I'm going to talk about. It's Guadalupe Island. It's about 120, 150 miles off the coast of western Mexico. It's about the same size, 65,000 acres, as if you go from here to Ridgeway, to Ouray, to Silverton, and then back to Telluride. And it's almost as rugged. So it's a big chunk of island, has 34 plants found nowhere else in the world, 4 animals found nowhere else in the world. It was absolutely decimated by goats that were introduced to the islands 120, 150 years ago, and they basically ate everything that was green on the island. So so there used to be this forest of 2 endemic trees, the Guadalupe pine, Guadalupe cypress, that grew on top of the island, and the goats basically ate all the seedlings every year, so there was no recruitment. So by 1948, the forest was only 1% of its former range, and by 2001, when we started working there, those same trees were dying just because they were old. And there's no seedlings that take their place. So there's only 120 surviving Guadalupe pines, 2,000 Guadalupe Island cypress. And then animals that depended on them, like this Guadalupe junco, were super endangered as well. That Guadalupe junco was critically endangered. So we spent about 3 years talking to people on the island, raising money, talking to the government, putting plans together. And then after a huge amount of hard work, we put a helicopter, some of the best hunters in the world and the best pilots in the world on a Mexican Navy boat, and we took it out to the island. And this gives you a sense of like working on the cliff sound. So there's a helicopter with hunters in it. They dropped off a hunter on this little ridge right here with some dogs. He's going to go up into these caves where the last remaining goats were, and they're going to shoot them. It's super hard, super technically complex project, dangerous. But in the end, after about 3.5 years, they got rid of the goats, and this is what the island looks like.
Wow.
There's 2,000, well, these are like relatively old numbers, but there are 2,000 Guadalupe Island pines. There are 20,000 Guadalupe Island cypress, and a bunch of other plants are coming back on island, including 6 species that we thought were extinct. They hadn't been seen in 50 years, but they're kind of hiding out either in seeds that were, still surviving, or like on remote cliffs where both the scientists and the goats couldn't find them. And then the Guadalupe Island junco is also responding to all this vegetation, and it's moved from critically endangered, the worst place to be, to only endangered, which is 10 times less likely to go extinct on average. So Island Conservation and Conservación de Islas have done lots of projects like this all over the world. They've saved more than 430 species, like the Guadalupe Island junco and like the Guadalupe Island pine and cypress, from extinction, and have grown into these like pretty big organizations with about $10 million combined budget, more than 100 employees, and but more importantly, they're part of this larger movement. They kind of help create this larger movement of other organizations that are doing this kind of work on islands all over the world. So invasive species eradications on islands has become like a mainstream conservation tool. And a lot of those people are smarter and harder working than me. They don't get distracted by like fresh powder and everything. They just go to work every day. So it just seems like this stuff's cruising, and I figured that I can have a bigger impact on conservation by turning my attention to that other habitat, that 0.8% of the world that's freshwater. And so I teamed up with Dr. Harmony Patricio, Telluride native, who's going to come up and talk about what we're doing now. Thanks, Harmony.
Thanks, Bernie. Thanks, everybody, for coming out on the post-crazy storm night. Let's see here. So, when I was a kid, hanging out in the old Wilkinson Library, which was much smaller than this, I never thought I would be up here giving one of those boring grown-up talks. But a few decades later, here I am. But I'm super inspired because Bernie and I have seen an opportunity, as he told you. The work that he's done on islands is highly transferable to freshwater systems. So we decided to start this new organization called Freshwater Life. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why freshwater systems are so cool and so important. So you already heard freshwaters cover less than 1% of the planet. Actually, it's 0.8% of the Earth's surface, but that tiny fraction of the Earth's surface contains at least 10% of all known species on the planet. And it has a higher number of fish species than the world's oceans, even though the oceans cover an area 70 times larger than freshwaters. Also, freshwaters provide essential food for people to eat, which is especially important to people living in developing countries, living in poverty, and especially important to women. It provides income and livelihoods for millions living in developing countries around the world. And as we told you, almost 1/3 of all extinctions have happened in freshwater systems. These are some of the species that we've lost so far. So this is a summary graph, kind of highlighting the points that Bernie's gone through, showing why freshwaters are important, the high level of extinctions that have happened in freshwaters, how important they are for food fish. And I think Bernie mentioned the 41% number. Okay, you didn't mention it. So of the extinctions that have occurred in freshwater systems, 41% of those were driven, at least in part, by the impacts of invasive species. So that's a big chunk of the extinctions. And that's why Bernie and I chose to focus on doing conservation work in freshwater ecosystems. So our new organization, Freshwater Life, hopefully, what we're aiming for is to save the world's most endangered freshwater species by eradicating the most damaging invasive species. I'm going to give you a few examples of successes of this type of work from colleagues at other organizations, and then I'll give you a little preview of what Freshwater Life is planning for the coming year. So this is the Rondegat River in South Africa. Invasive bass were introduced, and they ate every single individual of 3 different species of native fish. But local management authorities partnered up with bass anglers, got their support, and they eradicated all the bass. And now, all 3 native species recovered, including this endangered fiery redfin. So you can see when there was bass, they were totally gone. Nothing there. And after the bass were removed, their numbers went up over 5,000 individuals. This is Laguna de Zoñar in Córdoba, Spain. Non-native carp were introduced to this lake, and they ate all the aquatic vegetation and the zooplankton that normally water birds would eat. And then a lot of the native water birds population started declining. Then the government decided, oh, we're going to do something about this. They have this really endangered white-headed duck that was literally on the brink of extinction. So they eradicated the carp from the lake. The duck population has recovered. 5 other species of waterfowl also recovered, and flamingos. So invasive species eradications like this, especially involving carp, can have substantial positive benefits for people in society as well by improving water quality. This is an example from Ventura Marsh in Iowa, where they removed carp from one side of the marsh that had a barrier. And you can see there's a big difference in the water quality there. So around the world, there are thousands of opportunities like this to protect endangered native animals by eradicating invasive species. And we can improve water quality while we do it. So now that you've seen some of the examples of our colleagues' work, let me tell you about what we're planning for this coming year. Okay, this is like one of my favorite animals. This has to be the coolest salamander ever. They can regenerate their limbs. Like if a predator fish comes and bites off one of their legs, they can grow it back. And they're really culturally significant to the indigenous people living in central Mexico, who, for one thing, make a cough syrup from the skin of the axolotl. There are several axolotl species in Mexico, and they're all very highly endangered. This one is called the Zempoala axolotl. It lives in Lagunas de Zempoala National Park, which is a little ways outside of Mexico City, in these high mountain streams and lakes, kind of really beautiful, obviously. And the local people used to harvest them for food and medicine, and that was probably a sustainable level of use. But the real threat now is that trout and carp have been introduced to the lakes and streams where they're living, and trout and carp are eating axolotl eggs and young all the way up to adult axolotl. And so we're working with the indigenous community that lives around the park called the Chichinautzin community, and with a professor from a local university, Topis Contreras. And we're gonna go in there, eradicate the trout and carp, and let these awesome axolotl flourish. Okay, this one's pretty cool too. This striped gem, as I like to call it, is a pupfish that lives in a remote region of Turkey. It evolved in very harsh environments without other species of fish to compete with. But at one point, mosquito fish were introduced to their habitat in a kind of not so thoughtful program to try to control mosquitoes. Unfortunately, mosquito fish are much better at eating pupfish eggs and young than they are at eating actual mosquitoes. And the pupfish is really on the brink of extinction. So we're working with a colleague at a university in Turkey to try to eradicate the mosquito fish from some of these spring pools where the pupfish lives, and hopefully it can kind of regain its populations in its native springs.
What part of Turkey is that?
It's kind of, what's it, Achigol, do you know that? Achigol border,
Yeah.
that area?
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, this beautiful bird is the hooded grebe. It's one of the most highly endangered water birds in the world. It breeds in these high plateau lakes in Argentina. It kind of looks like the area around Fairplay, Colorado. In the past, these lakes never had any fish in them, but trout were introduced for aquaculture, and the trout eat all the zooplankton and little shrimp-like critters that live in the lake, so there's nothing left for the grebes to feed to their chicks, and their populations are just plummeting. So we're going to partner up with local gaucho ranchers and a local organization called Asociación Ambiente Sur, and we're going to lease some of these lakes from the landowners and develop agreements with them to remove the trout so that the food for the grebes can recover and the grebes can use these lakes again for breeding and nesting. So let's just go back to the graph that Bernie showed you near the beginning of the talk. The Freshwater Life projects I talked to you about and others that we're looking into, these have the chance to provide real world, on the ground impacts that will let us add a new category to this graph. The saved category. So the projects I just described to you, there's actually 7 species that will benefit from these projects because there are other native endangered fish in these habitats that are also threatened by the invasive species. And so in our first year, we'll make this graph change a little bit to look like this. A small but noticeable difference in the number of critically endangered species represented by the green at the top of the red bars. I know it doesn't look like much, but it's only Freshwater Life's first year. But in 10 years, we have a very good chance of being somewhere like this, where we can make a real globally significant difference for species conservation and preventing extinctions. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions
Any questions?
that we can answer?
Yeah, in the freshwater world, like, what are the most invasive species? Like, are there a couple of things that you're seeing consistently in a lot of different parts of the world where there might be a similar approach to tackle the problem?
Carp is a big one. Trout is a big one. Any others you would throw in there?
Northern pike.
Pike is a big one.
Northern pike are a big
In
one, but not in
Western
terms of
US.
causing extinctions. 'Cause
Yes.
They tend to be introduced in, like, there's a lot of introductions like in Alaska and North America, but fewer, but they're there for sure.
What's the name of those mussels that are
The
giving all these-
zebra mussel?
mussels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Any
they're a
plan for
problem.
them?
Well, I don't know how much they would affect extinctions as far, I haven't seen
Yeah.
any data on that. They definitely
Yeah, what I,
compete with native
at
species.
least from the island conservation world, there's like the tools that work to do eradications, and then there's all the species that are causing extinctions, and they don't always match up. And so right now, there's a really good tool to do invasive fish eradications, a couple. There's nothing really out there to do like mussel or crayfish eradications or plankton eradications. So we're right now anyway focused on fish.
What is that tool?
I actually have a slide about that. Okay, so the most effective way to eradicate invasive fish is, and it's also the least environmentally destructive tool, it's a plant-based substance called rotenone. It's been used for thousands of years by indigenous people in Central and South America and in Southeast Asia. This is a photo of an indigenous man in Peru. They take the roots of certain species of plant in the legume family that contain this compound. They like macerate the roots and then shake it up in the water, and it makes it hard for the fish to respirate through their gills. So the fish come to the surface and they can just scoop them up, go home and have dinner. And rotenone has been gone through tons of tests and reviews by the World Health Organization and the EPA, and it's not toxic to other animals or mammals or even people who eat fish that have been killed by rotenone, and it degrades really quickly in the environment. So that's really the most effective tool.
Oh, I'll do it.
I wonder if you have any opinions about the kind of the indigenous fish on the Colorado River, you know, like the pupfish or the razorback or the squawfish or any of those. And of course, sport fishing is huge up there. And how do you trade off those two kind of objectives or desires among the people who go to that region?
I could go ahead.
There's you know, it's the same thing with islands, and you're just kind of looking for that sweet spot where there are critically endangered species and where there's not a lot of human use of those invasive fish, and finding that compromise. So like our South African colleagues didn't try to eradicate bass from all of South Africa. They worked with the bass anglers and said, like, okay, there's this couple spots where the bass are eating all these endemic fish that don't occur anywhere else but those spots. Is it okay if we take them from there and then leave you with this? Like, and Harmony was talking about that project in Argentina. There are thousands of lakes up on that plateau that have introduced trout and used to have grebes, but some of those lakes have tourism industries and some have thriving aquaculture businesses, but others, the trout are just there, no one's really making that much money, and those are the places that we want to work. And so you know, you just got to find that balance.
Yeah, and I've spoken with some of the resource managers around the area, like Parks and Wildlife and the Forest Service, and they've kind of are looking at kind of a patchwork of restoring certain habitats for native species and then keeping others for sport fishing. Like I believe Miramonte Reservoir is a really popular sport fishing place, and so they're managing Miramonte, to have some non-native species, but it's really important for the economy and the community. But then Woods Lake, where, there was some good fishing there before, but it's also incredibly great habitat for cutthroat trout. So they went in there, they used rotenone, got rid of all the non-native fish and restocked it with cutthroat trout, and they told me now the cutthroat are doing so well that they're able to harvest eggs from Woods Lake to restock other creeks and rivers in the area. So I think it's kind of like Bernie said, you have to kind of balance things a little bit and go to those sweet spots.
Did you have a question?
Oh.
Yeah.
My question is is a byproduct of all of this also cleaning up the waters that make it more drinkable and more user-friendly to indigenous populations, especially like in Africa or
Carp.
India or any? Is there an advantage in cleaning up the water to make it more?
So carp are particularly known for reducing water quality. They just love to dig around in the mud in the bottom and stir everything up. So I think for carp especially, there's a lot of opportunities to improve water quality all over the world because carp have been introduced all over the world. So definitely for carp. Do you have other thoughts, Bernie?
Well, just that in general, I mean, indigenous communities have had this cultural evolution that is place-based, right? So they have recipes and legends and ceremonies and food dishes that are based on native species. And so when you restore those native species, you can restore part of their sort of cultural heritage. And for island conservation, we've worked really closely with the Haida Nation in Western Canada on some rat and deer eradications on the Haida Gwaii Islands, because they were into it. They wanted island conservation to help them do those eradications to restore their native ecosystem, and island conservation has worked closely with the native Hawaiian community to do a couple different eradication projects in Hawaii. So in that sense, the native communities that we've worked with in the past with island conservation have been really excited about these kind of projects. Yeah.
How does the reintroduction process work? Because in some areas, a species has gone extinct from that area. They may still exist in an aquarium or in other, like, human-built places. But if they can be truly extinct in the wild, and then perhaps if the habitat is available again, they could be reintroduced.
Yeah, definitely. There are certain zoos and aquaria that have special conservation breeding programs for species that are, pretty much extinct in the wild, so those can be a source to restock areas. But yeah, by doing the work that we're planning about, we'll be increasing the amount of habitat that's available so that you could restock areas and increase the populations. And yeah.
So where are you guys headquartered, and how many projects do you have in the works?
Well, I'm working out of the Telluride Institute offices. Thank you very much to them for offering me a desk space. And what was your other question?
How many projects do you have in the
How
works?
many projects? Let's see, right now we got Turkey, Croatia, Mexico, Argentina, India.
Yeah.
5?
Yeah.
About 5.
Or 5. And right now we're a sub-project of the Telluride Community Foundation.
Oh,
The
really?
Telluride Foundation, yeah.
Telluride Foundation.
So you guys are using your expertise to find the low economic impact areas with high biodiversity impact areas to save, and that sounds great. But I just have a question about those charts at the end. So you showed goals for a few years from now and then for 10 years from now. And so you're really going to be able to focus on some high impact endemic areas to get what looks like several hundred species saved, and I mean, we're talking about a lot of endemism, right?
Yeah.
So high watersheds where there's restricted diversity, specialist species in those areas, and so that's the forecast, huh? You've been able to identify those types of areas to get hundreds of species already.
Well, that's up there.
It's a
So
10-year.
that forecast, if you notice, I cleverly used the fade feature on the bottom. So there's a certain amount of wiggle room in there. But here's what happened with islands. Like when we started, in the 1990s, a big island to do a rat eradication on was about 100 hectares. In the 1980s, a big island to do a rat eradication on was a hectare. Today, I think the biggest islands they're doing rat eradications on are like 50,000 hectares. And so the technology gets better, the capacity gets better. People's it's also a cultural thing, right? Like people are starting to realize they can do bigger and more complicated projects, and you get bigger and more serious funding. So it's all sort of technology, culture, funding all come together, and you start ramping things up. The biggest freshwater fish eradications have been huge from like massive river systems in Norway. They were driven by aquaculture money because there were threats to aquaculture. So the potential to do really big systems is there. The money might not be there, the vision might not be there. Yeah. Like you mean Freshwater Life, the organization.
Yeah, the Spanish named.
Oh, well, so Island Conservation.
Yeah.
I'm wearing a shirt. I got a shirt, but I like moved on. So it got kind of big and fancy and beyond my managerial abilities. So I worked to find someone like who's a better manager and smarter to run the organization. So I don't run Island Conservation anymore.
Okay.
It's headquartered in Santa Cruz. The Mexico organization, Conservación Islas, is headquartered in Ensenada, Baja California. Yeah.
Now, are you guys affiliated with them or no?
I mean, you know, like
Friends.
culturally,
Yeah.
we're friends, we're best friends, yeah. And, you know, a lot of the permitting issues, a lot of the compliance issues, a lot of the technology is transferable. So we're relying heavily on, you know, some of the technical skills that people in island conservation have that they'll lend Freshwater Life. Since I hired them, you know, years ago.
So when you say you have 5 projects, these are projects you guys are doing, not Island Conservation?
These are projects that Harmony has developed for Freshwater Life. Island Conservation has tens of projects
I see.
going on. Conservación Islas is the same. But these are just the freshwater fish eradication projects.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Are those 5 projects in different parts of the world, or are you focusing more locally?
To start out, we're focusing a little more internationally, but we are talking with Parks and Wildlife and the Forest Service to see if there's ways we can partner up and collaborate. But right now, we've identified partners and projects that seem like we can get them done quickly and see a conservation benefit fairly quickly without spending a huge amount of money. And so we've got potential projects that we're currently developing the methods and fundraising for in Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, Croatia, and India. Yeah.
And then you also did work in Vietnam, right?
Before my PhD and during my PhD, I worked in the Mekong River in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam.
For the extinct species, what's like filling those niches there?
For fish?
You're the freshwater ecologist.
For like fish?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the fish that have gone extinct were like highly endemic, highly range restricted, and specialists. So I think the niche that they would be, I mean, I guess it would vary depending on what type of system you're thinking about, but you know, nutrient cycling, definitely, habitat formation, influencing the trophic processes.
Yeah, I think probably the real answer is we don't know. A lot of these extinctions happened a long time ago. A lot of them happen in really remote places. But in some cases, we have a sense like that, say, some of these bird extinctions, those birds used to pollinate certain plants and disperse the seeds of certain plants, and we know that at least in the Hawaiian Islands, that's basically not happening now. And those plants are really endangered in part because no one's moving their seeds around and no one's pollinating them. So they're kind of interbreeding and selfing along.
So do we know about these extinctions, just DNA records, or what?
No, these are all, there's this incredible and incredibly frustrating source called the IUCN Red List, which is an attempt to assess the status of all plants and animals. But it really is only good for vertebrates. And you can look up stuff on there. So you can go to the IUCN Red List and you can say, I wonder what's gone extinct in the United States and in Colorado, and you can do a search like that and and figure it out.
One more.
Yeah.
So that, payment for ecosystem services is something that affects all of us. There are initiatives here in the county to do the same thing. So what are you guys doing to recompensate? Is it private owners mostly, or public land that you're working on? And what's your selling tool for getting more older native species back in the mix?
So, there's this idea that we all benefit from conservation. So the benefits tend to be spread really widely, but the costs of conservation are often like borne by landowners and local people, especially like indigenous communities or poor rural landowners. So if you're in Africa, if you're in Namibia, and you're a poor farmer, and you have elephants and rhinos around your house, like that's awesome because we can fly over there and check those out, but they might kill that farmer's kid, or they might come in and eat all their crops. And because those people are poor, it's particularly difficult for them, right? It's not like, oh man, I lost all my food, I have to go down to Clark's and buy some more, like run up my Visa bill. It's like there's nothing. So there's these ideas of helping pay people to provide these ecosystem services, or these environmental goods that we all benefit from. And in the project the work we're doing, it kind of depends. Some of these places, like they're really tiny little ponds and pools, and there aren't many people using them. Like that would be like this Greek case, or the Turkish case. And then, like in Mexico, the indigenous community, they're pretty into it. They're not using those trout or the carp in a big way. There are a number of other lakes there that no one's touching the carp in, or no one's touching the trout in. So that's okay. We're thinking about maybe helping them out in the long run by doing a carp eradication, just eradicating carp from one of their trout lakes to make the trout fishing better. And then in Argentina, we are asking the landowners to take the trout out of some of the lakes and to make sure water keeps flowing into those lakes. And we're going to have to pay for that. We haven't worked that contract out yet. But then that's just like a straight, these are relatively wealthy landowners, they're business people, and so it's like a long-term lease where we're leasing the water rights, a buffer zone around the pond, or I shouldn't say we, like our Argentine partners. Yeah, so I think it depends, and we'll just have to evaluate other cases in the future.
I know that there are a lot of, there's a real sort of a cult of the pupfish in the desert Southwest,
Yeah.
Texas, Arizona, that people are just really, really championing this tiny little fish because of its ability to live in hot, salty water in the desert, and they understand, or the feeling that those fish will have the ability to produce medicines from their ability to live in those particularly adverse waters. Means that they've got amazing kidneys. That means that they maybe have amazing, potential for producing medicine for diabetes and different things like that. Do you think that there's any financial, support from the big bad pharma? Or is that too much of a stretch?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of research, the axolotl that I showed you, that's being used a lot for medical research because of their regenerative abilities. I haven't heard of any big pharma companies wanting to start a research program with pupfish. Have you heard anything like that, Bernie?
No, I mean,
Best kidneys on the planet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think our, goal is to help save these species from extinction, and the people who you know, own those species in a sense, like the local communities then can benefit from them in some way. And, you know, so if they can set up a deal with researchers or, you know, with pharmaceutical companies or, you know, the pet trade or whatever, that's great. Then they have the abundance of that animal or that plant to, you know, to do that with.
So Harmony, when you go into a project like this, what kind of costs do you end up looking at when you start out? It sounds like you have to go and do a lot of work first off with the community, find partners, and then after you've done all that groundwork, legwork, start the planning, and then you go in there and actually do some rotenone or something, and then do you monitor then afterwards when you do that too? Like we talked about?
Yeah, you pretty much have the process down. It's just a, you know, progressive planning, building relationships, getting the permits from the government. That's not an easy step always. Also, post monitoring definitely, because we want to like see that our effort is having a positive effect for the native species, and we also want to see what other effects it has for those systems. Like we want to measure water quality parameters and look at the invertebrate abundance, because those are all really important indicators of ecosystem health. So definitely we're planning, like for the project in Mexico, we're working with this university and with the Chichinautzin community. We're going to train and pay people from the community and students from the university to do a lot of the field work and data collection. And the idea behind that is then, like, the next project we want to do will have already this group of people who are into it, who have the training, and we'll get some employment opportunities from it. So yeah, that's a big piece of it, is monitoring afterwards. And then the cost, it really depends on the scale of the project. I mean, lower end maybe around 50,000, higher end maybe a couple 100,000, kind of range in there. But yeah, it kind of depends on whether we can use rotenone or if we have to use gill nets instead, and you know, the number of labor hours that it takes to use gill nets is a big cost. And so yeah, it does vary between the projects, or just the scale and size of the water body. But
And how long do you do the post operation monitoring?
right now we're thinking at least a year. We'll wait at least a year after the eradication and give the system a chance to do its thing, and then start monitoring for at least another year.
Is there any concern about having adverse, unexpected, harmful effects?
Yeah, absolutely. You always have to
And do you
think
monitor
about
for those?
that. We'll definitely, before we do any eradications, we'll do a really thorough survey of the water body to see what's there. You know, if there are rare native fish like there with also the invasive fish, and there's not like a source population to restock that water body, then you have to like go in and catch and remove the native fish, hold them in a tank, remove the invasive fish, and put the native fish back in. So that can get pretty complicated. Yeah.
Okay, so we told the library that we'd be out of here by 7. But we can hang out. There's some cookies and tea and stuff like that back there, and even some other food you guys should grab on your way out. And then Harmony and I will like put away chairs and stuff, but are also here to keep chatting and answering any questions you guys have.
Well, I was just curious, your priority project, like, which is the one that you're most, it's the highest priority and the biggest threat, where you're moving in the quickest?
For me, it's a tie between Mexico with the axolotl and Argentina with the hooded grebe. What about you, Bernie?
I'd say that.
think those are the two that we have like closest to like ready to do field work and
Ready to go.
ready to go, and have a really good potential of like seeing conservation benefits out of them in the short term.
Thank you.
I'm
Yes.
thank you.